be our second session on the book of Psalms, and it's a study we've been doing. Psalms, the character of God, and this was written by Jerry Rankin, and it gives us a view of God's Word, a way of understanding it, a way of living it, and it shows the Psalms as being divided into 5 different groups, and it gives us a way to study those groups and to challenge ourselves in taking them and ingesting them in our life and our understanding and living them out. So the last session, Clint was teaching through Psalm 22, 23, and 24. And just to give you a quick reminder on what those Psalms were a picture of.
Yeah, I spent more time probably on Psalm 22, but Psalm 22 is kind of a flip-flop between David and Jesus on the cross. Now, I, as a New Testament Christian, looking back at it, see it that way. Mm-hmm. You know, David wrote it under the guidance of the Lord's Spirit. He didn't know what that day was going to be like. But anyway, we see that picture there. So Psalm 22 is kind of showing us that in our salvation experience, Jesus paying the penalty for our sin. Psalm 23 is one of the most famous Psalms, the Good Shepherd Psalm, and talks about the Lord walking with us daily in our lives. And then 24 was the future. God, the supreme God of all creation, the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, ruling in His place. And there's a passage in there, who can get in there? Well, people with clean hearts. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what we looked at there.
And so today's section of Psalms is Psalms 73 through 83. These are Psalms that we call Psalms of lament. And the heading of the chapter that Mr. Rankin gave us here is God's goodness can be seen in His justice and mercy. And just a quick aside, we often think of justice as punishment. For example, someone goes to a courtroom and they get a fine or they get an imprisonment sentence, and we say justice was served. But justice is really about making things right. And many times a punishment doesn't necessarily make things right. It helps bring about potentially justice, but that itself is not necessarily just justice of itself. And so when we think about justice in terms of who God is and the character of God, you have to understand that it's about making things right. In fact, it's one of the reasons Isaiah talks about flattening out mountains and putting streams in deserts and things like that, because God's justice is about bringing hope where there is no hope, bringing correction where there's been lack of correction. And so that's another way of understanding it. Psalm 73 is a psalm that I'm going to talk about for a few minutes. And then we'll jump over and briefly talk about Psalm 83, what they call an imprecatory psalm. And we'll make a few comments on it, but I'm going to leave that one fairly wide open. I had an opportunity, I taught this psalm to the students just this past Wednesday, the Wednesday before last. It was where we were at. We're studying the book of Psalms. We've been studying the book of Psalms now for about 5 months. And it's just a passion that I have to understand how these people were communicating to and about God, and how they were sharing their hopes or desires or feelings or emotions, and then how that transformed them and made them different. So Psalm 73 is a fairly familiar psalm, and it starts out like this. Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet had almost slipped. I had nearly lost my foothold. He goes on to say, for I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have no struggles. Their bodies are healthy and strong. They are free from common human burdens. They are not plagued by human ills. This is what we get when we look at somebody else's life. Therefore, pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. From their callous hearts comes iniquity. Their evil imaginations have no limits. He goes on to say this in verse 13. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. All day long I have been afflicted, and every morning brings new punishments. If I had spoken out like that, I would have betrayed your children. When I tried to understand all this, it troubled me deeply until I entered the sanctuary of God. The psalmists use language, picturesque language, to help us understand what is happening in their hearts, what is happening in their minds, and what's happening with their emotions. And the psalmist says this, it was like I was slipping. I lost myself. And when I was talking to the students, I asked them this, I'm like, have you ever considered a point in your life when you say, you know what, I really was just starting to lose control over my thoughts, over my who I was, or my behaviors, over my actions? And that's what he's saying. He says, I lost myself in the midst of everything else. I literally lost myself. And so if you've ever been in a creek bed, and I love to go up into North Georgia and North Carolina, and I'm one of those kind of people you see on the side of the road, and I'll pull off the side of the road and wade out into the rivers and streams, and you can slip and fall out there really quickly and get yourself completely wet, and then have to get in the car and your dad tear your behind up because you got back in the car wet. Not that I speak from experience or anything, but that's the picture he's like. He's like, here I am just going on along, and the next thing you know, my feet are out from under me, and I have no control. And if you've fallen, you know that feeling. You know that moment of just absolute panic, where your arms shoot out straight, your legs kick straight, and there's nothing there, and you're just in midair. And that's the picture he's doing it. But with that comes this observation. And it's interesting because what the psalmist does here is thinks about what he's thinking about. And by the way, humans are the only beings that can do that. Dogs can't think about what they're thinking about. A dog can't say, I'm thinking about a bone because my master just dropped a bone in front of me, or because I just saw a commercial. He can't do that. He can't go back and regurgitate that. But a human can go back and think about our thoughts. We can evaluate our own thoughts. And the idea there is the psalmist begins this psalm with a moment of introspection. It's a moment of realization of where he is at personally. And man, that's difficult. And especially what he goes on to say. He's like, I was in a moment of panic. My feet had almost slipped. Everything was just about to crash and tumble. I nearly lost my foothold. But then he goes on from that. So he has a moment of introspection, this moment where he's like, this is what's happening to me. And let me just really quickly, briefly say this. It's hard to do that. We don't do that. That requires silence. That requires some truth-telling to ourselves. That requires some truthful observation. So he goes on from introspection to the second thing. So the first thing is he thinks about what he's thinking about. And the second thing is he runs his behavior in front of him. And what I call is this. He goes from introspection to examination. And look what he says. For I envied the arrogant when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. So he says, well, why are my feet slipping? And he goes and he says, why are my feet slipping? Oh, I see it. I'm looking at all these people and I'm thinking they got their stuff together. I'm looking at all these people, I think they got their act together.
I wrote a note here in my Bibles, he lost focus. Instead of focusing day by day, minute by minute on walking with the Lord, he started looking somewhere else. He shouldn't have been looking.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, but here's, such a, and then I don't want to say this too much because I'll lose myself in it, but you go back to the fact that we are the only beings that can think about our thoughts. You can go back, if you want to, if it's 10 o'clock at night or if it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and you can think about thoughts that you had an hour ago. You can think about the last program you watched on television and think about what you thought about when you were watching that program. And the responses it brought in you.
Yeah.
But you can only do that if you decide to. So he willfully puts himself in a position where he has to realize what he's been doing. And then he begins to parade the things in front of him. Look what he says. So basically he said, I envied them because of their arrogance. Okay? Then I saw their prosperity. And he's like, I saw their prosperity. One of the things I've challenged my personal kids with, my children with, is this. Every parent hears this. Mom, Dad, can I have this? Can I go there? And I know where that comes from. It comes from a friend having it, or a friend's ability to do this. And I was with my son, it was probably 2 years ago. It's 2 years ago. And we were at a soccer game. And he was playing soccer. We left the soccer game. He goes home. I go home. A couple of hours go by. And it's one of those late night, oh, we don't have this for in the morning. And so that's fine. I get in the car, everybody in the house is asleep, and I go back to the store and I buy what we need. And who do I see in the store but one of his soccer teammates pushing a cart in the store because he was at work. And so I said to my son, and I said this, I said, he wasn't asking for anything at the time. It wasn't a punishment thing. It wasn't a parent lecture. I guess it was a lecture, but I said, son, when we look, we usually look up. Who has and we don't have. I said, but you and I both need to learn how to look down and what do we have that others don't have. And this is what's happening here. He says, because I saw their prosperity, but that's not real. We know this. It's not real prosperity. It just looks like prosperity. And he goes on to say, he says this, they have no struggles, their bodies are healthy and strong. Those are two things that are lies. But when you're looking from the outside, it sure looks like some people just don't have problems.
Right.
And here's the thing. When your feet are coming out from under you and your arms are shooting out straight, all of a sudden anybody that's standing upright or looks to be standing upright looks like they have no problems. And so this is what's happening to him. And so their hearts are free from common human burdens. They are not plagued by human ills. And then he goes into, this is why they're like that. And this is why examination is so good, because he said, therefore pride is their necklace. They clothe themselves with violence. He begins to realize something about these people. Mm-hmm. And this is why this process, I think, is why I was trying to make a point, such a distinct point to the students, that introspection and examination of other people should lead you to discover, as ultimately happens here with the psalmist, the character and nature of God, because what you think is happening there is not happening there. He says this, they clothe themselves with violence, their callous hearts bring iniquity, their evil imaginations have no limits. All of a sudden he realizes he doesn't want to be those people. He doesn't even really like their behaviors. In fact, their behaviors are harming to him and harming to the rest of the world. And, it's interesting because people will argue and say, well, where is God and how is justice brought about and what is happening here? But the psalmist is actually revealing how it is that these people themselves are bringing their own judgment on themselves as their behavior intensifies and magnifies. And he goes on to say that what he has done, he felt like was in vain. And what he is doing there is he's doing the next thing we can do as humans, and that's forecasting. And he is saying, my effort plus whatever else is happening in my life, it's not going to bring about the intended results. And he's right, except he's wrong, because he leaves God out of the equation when he begins to make that observation. Because later on he says this, and this is where we have to go. Verse 21. He says, when my heart was grieved and my spirit embittered, I was senseless and ignorant. I was a brute beast before you. Yet I am always with you. Now listen to what he says about who God is. You hold me by my right hand. You guide me with your counsel, and afterward you will take me into glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire beside you. And then he says a quote that we're very familiar with, many of us. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. So you had this psalmist run the entire gamut of emotions, the entire, I guess, options of spiritual realities in his life. But when he does so, he doesn't do it for personal benefit. He does it, and as he does it, he realizes the nature and the divinity of God, and it changes him, and it challenges him.
I found something as I went through this in verse 17, because like you talked about, he's slipping, he's looking where he ought not to be looking. He's for a second or so there, he's like, I want to be like them. They're prosperous. But then, oh no, wait a minute. They're pretty bad people, really, because he goes down through all of this. He gets down in verse 13 through 15. You see the doubt that he had until he hits verse 17. until I entered God's sanctuary, then I understood their destiny. It's like you get your eyes back on God, get your heart back where it belongs, and God gives you that peace and that understanding that you can't find anywhere else. You can't find in all that stuff.
Yeah, and we often take that verse there and we say, well, that's God's house, the church, so to speak, and most certainly gathering with believers is part of being in the sanctuary of God. It's part of being in the presence of God. But it's not just a building or a place or a worship time. What he is saying there is, I was willing to venture outside of who God was. And now when I resubmit myself to who God is, then I understand truth and I understand reality. There's a way of speaking there that says, I went back to what I knew, and I entered the sanctuary of God. In other words, I went back to who I know you are, and who you are for all time, which is why he goes on the end and says,
the one who never fails.
He said, the one that held my hand.
Yeah.
Well, even though in verse 2 he says, I'd slipped. My feet had almost slipped. I was basically free falling, but then he goes back to 24 and says, or verse 23 says, you hold me by my right hand. And I mean, how do we take those two pictures and put them side by side? The only way to take those two pictures and put them side by side is one of a person, losing their balance and just going off the deep end, and another of someone holding to the hand of the master and the father, is the perspective of the individual, not the circumstances of the individual. Because he details it's not his circumstances that changed him. It's his perspective. And that's why what you're saying there, when I went back into the sanctuary, when I committed myself to understanding who God was, that's when I began to change. So.
Yeah, I made a note in my little Bible here on that. You're talking about to hold my right hand part. To John 10:28. What is it? No man shall pluck him out of my hand.
Yep.
That security of the believer right there. And sometimes you're hurting so bad and things are really, really could be really bad in somebody's life. Well, they can't even explain it. They just know, God is still here. God is still with me. Everything's falling apart. Everything's awful. Everything's bad. Maybe they're dying. I don't know. But God's still there. And sometimes they can't really express it, but they're just holding on to everything they got right there. And God always responds. Always responds. You guide me with your counsel. Afterward, you will take me up in glory. And he doesn't give up on us, ever.
Yeah, and he goes from saying that he had almost slipped to saying that he understood at the end that the people that were truly on slippery ground were those who were relying on themselves. And you see that in verse, I think it's 18 and 19.
Yeah.
But then he goes into this area where he's like, well, it's kind of like a dream. Like he was saying, it was almost like being in a fantasy. He says they are like a dream when one awakes. He's talking about those, the arrogant and the prideful, that they can't even understand their situation when confronted with the reality of who God is. And I thought about that because and I don't understand it. Maybe I think I do in some ways in a minuscule way. But in America, where we live, and this is not a condemnation, this is just an observation. We are steeped in religious tradition, good religious tradition. We would celebrate.
America's famous
good
for
religious
tradition.
And then you add to that we're in the South, and we, church culture and all these things that are good. And so I have a tendency to base my standing with God based on my morality and what I've done and how my behaviors have aligned with who God is, or at least the perspective I have on God. And then in moments of what we would call ministry, in moments of serving, in moments of exposure where you allow yourself to join someone else in their pain or join someone else in their loss, you find broken individuals who also love God, who face torments and pains that I don't understand. And then I look around and say, well, is the reality my house and my possessions and this comfortable, smooth life that I live? Or is there another reality? And I think that that's one of the things where people are going to wake up like they're in a dream and think, I really did something for God, because I've been there. You wake up and it's all of a sudden like, this isn't reality. I'm not where I thought I was. Because God, especially God through Jesus, as revealed through Jesus, and Clint and I were talking before we even started this study about what it meant for Jesus to wash people's feet. He didn't sit down and peel off their shoes and peel off their socks and, get a little whiff of, foot odor. These were people that walked around in nothing but sandals all the time on dirt roads where their feet would have been caked and split and cracking. And Clint's seen that and experienced that in one of the cultures that he served in. And to do that, to take the lowest form and to sit on the floor with a towel wrapped around you and put those feet in your lap and wash them and realize how degrading that was to him in that moment. If anybody had walked in, they would not have thought that was the Messiah. They would have thought that was the slave. Right. Which is why Peter said, get up, you're not doing that to me. You're not going to take that position to me. And Jesus said, if I don't take this position, you have nothing at all. But here's the flip of that. He then turns around and says to Peter, follow me and do what I just did, feed my sheep. So if you and I cannot figure this out, and I don't mean in a performance way, like do more, do better, do harder, but if we can't figure out this service thing, then one day we're going to wake up and it's going to be like a dream, and we're not even going to know what's reality and what's not, which is why Jesus says, many will say unto me that day, Lord, Lord. They had an observation of who they thought God was, and God wasn't even who they thought he was. And this psalm just turns all that on our head. But I just remind you this. It begins by a psalmist willingly just laying himself before God and saying, here I am. And here's what's going on. And this is what I see, and this is what I think, and this is what I think I'm thinking. And, and look how it turns.
But David had no trouble. And you're not talking about a wimpy guy. You're talking about a manly man. A manly man who camped out there with the sheep and fought the wild animals and, all of that. And he's that kind of a guy, And today he'd live out there in Okefenokee and fight alligators and bears. But manly man, but yet he has no trouble totally opening up his heart to God. Mm-hmm. He doesn't hide. He holds nothing back. And we as people need to understand that God loves us that much that we can actually say, God, I don't understand this. God, I'm angry right now, and I guess I'm angry at you, and I'm sorry, but I am. Help me, And we're even afraid to say those words.
Yeah.
We're afraid to just open up our heart and let God take over. And David was great at that.
The next psalm that we're going to just briefly look at is Psalm 83. And I mentioned this at the beginning. This is called an Imprecatory Song.
That's a big word.
Yeah, and I think I'm pronouncing it right. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I'm only pronouncing it because I'm looking at it and it's in bold print for me to understand it there on the page. And basically an imprecatory psalm is where you are basically saying to God, get them.
Prayer against the enemies.
Yeah.
You
got a little subtitle there?
Subtitle.
Mine doesn't have that. It just says a song. And listen to this. It's a song. It's literally a song. Much ado has been made about this over the years. Is it right to pray imprecatory songs? Is it right to pray it against this specific person or this specific nation or this specific circumstances? And I would say this is where I would start out. This psalm would have originally been a personal psalm, as every psalm written was, as every song that you hear on the radio is. I mean, most of them start as personal. It's a person thinking about a particular situation and responding to it, or thinking about how it might work out. And so that's where the psalm begins. Later on, it becomes a psalm. I mean, a psalm, like a sung song. And they sing about it. And, you know, at parts, that can be hard to understand. And I would just say this. In a remembrance of these psalms, personally, I would hesitate to ever use an imprecatory psalm in a public setting, mostly because I feel like that would be a magnification of myself over a particular person or individual. And the second part of that is that it is easier to be caught up in anger than it is just about any other emotion. And so keep that in mind as you do this. And so that's where we're getting started at there. The psalmist starts out, and I'm just going to read a couple verses. It says, "O God, do not remain silent. Do not turn a deaf ear. Do not stand apart, O God. See how your enemies growl, how your foes raise their heads." So it's not just a God, go get them. It's a God, look, they're winning. They're getting everything they want. They're getting everything. They're having free reign. And he goes on to say this, that their desire in verse 12 is let them take possession of the pasture lands of God. These are people that want to take over the physical state of Israel at that point in time. And then he turns it into the imprecatory part where he says, make them like tumbleweed. Let them blow away. Let them be lost. Make them like chaff before the wind. And I think that's interesting because we look at these things. He talks about a fire consumes the forest, and we look at those sorts of things. We get those parts, but we forget how he starts this thing by basically saying, God, make them go away. And so it's just a call. I see the imprecatory Psalms as a call for deliverance, a call for God to intervene in a situation where we feel, or the psalmist feels like God's just been avoiding them for an extended period of time.
Yeah, of course, I agree with you. I probably wouldn't want to pray something like that in public. You know, it is a lot easier to get angry at people and say, God, just track them all in.
Yeah.
You know, and that's not where we ought to be as people. Instead, we ought to be, Lord, you know, please deliver me from whatever this is. Get them to stop doing what they're doing, but help them to see the light. Help them to know there's a better way to live.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting though. Once again, where this psalm
Perspective
resides in this passage of scriptures. The psalm resides right after a call for mercy. Right after a call for remembrance of who God is. And I just want to read a couple verses out of Psalm 82. God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. And this doesn't mean that, you know, there's this little court somewhere where the gods show up. It just means over all the things that men enthrone, power, possessions, wealth, notoriety, those are the things we enthrone. Those are the little G's.
Yeah.
God sits above all of those things.
Yeah.
And the psalmist's cry is that you will do something and you will defend the unjust. There's a call for mercy for those who are suffering that then rolls into this psalm where he says, hey, you got these people that are trying to destroy us and we need you to make them go away. And so there's a great call for mercy in the midst of this imprecatory call.
I'm thinking of, I said perspective earlier, I was thinking of David did not have the perspective that we have, looking back through the lens that is Jesus Christ at these people, at that situation. So for us as Christians today, we probably wouldn't pray that prayer the way he wrote it. You know, it'd have to be a little bit different. But having said that, I'm sure there are people in the world today who are believers. I've known people who, in a persecution environment, who were being killed, who were being chased, who were being hounded. I watched a man sit and just cry his heart out. And I think they had burned his house again. And yet none of those people did I ever hear them say like David did,
Yeah.
because the perspective is different.
Well, and I think that goes back to the original part of just a few minutes ago where I was saying that, we're called into service. And that's what Jesus has called it. And by the way, David was a servant king, which is one of the reasons why we're told that he was, a man after God's own heart. He was a servant king. He desired to be a servant king. Now, flawed as he was, he had those desires about him that he put into motion. And we can see those. He also felt like he had a physical kingdom to defend and honor. And Jesus put that to rest by making the new Israel and the new Jerusalem, which exists outside of physical boundaries. When Jesus brought the kingdom of heaven into existence and invited everybody into it, and said the maimed come in and the broken come in, and everybody wants to come in, and that one can come in, and the one that doesn't have enough, he can come in. And all of a sudden the religious people are looking in from the outside and saying, well, what do I got to do to get in? And Jesus said, well, you got to get shed of everything you think you've got.
Yeah.
And so David would have gone through that. I think it's an interesting perspective, though, because the Jews believed in resurrection. Job believed in resurrection, and you find tons of hints of it throughout Isaiah. Well, I mean, there's not hints
Pharisees,
of it
I
throughout
believe
Isaiah.
in resurrection.
So they argued. I mean, that was a staple of their religion. And yet when Jesus said he was coming back to the earth, or he was going to come back, they mocked him. Because their religiosity had overtaken their belief in resurrection. And so they had lost their understanding of what resurrection meant. And I struggle with that, Dave, because I think that a lot of times when I evaluate people or run into people and I get a critical and condemning spirit, that I realize that I've allowed my religiosity to get in get in the way of my view of resurrection, my view of what is to come. So.
Well, thank you all for listening to us. I hope it's helpful. If you think we got it wrong, let us know. And I hope you enjoy your own study as we go through Psalms some of the Psalms during this month of February here at the church.
Yeah, and we'll do next week. We should next week do another series. We'll be getting them out as we go. So thank y'all for joining us.